All right, so we're diving into this 1974 horror film called Vampyres. We're going to dissect a review of it that you sent over and see what makes it so unique and if it's actually something that maybe you'd even like.
Yeah, the reviewer seemed really fascinated by it.
Yeah.
So I think we'll have a lot to talk about.
Okay, cool. So let's start with the basics.
Okay.
The movie is set in the English countryside where we meet these two mysterious women, Fran and Miriam.
Okay.
They live in a secluded mansion.
This sounds creepy already.
Right, but they're not exactly like the welcoming committee.
Oh.
They lure men to their mansion, but instead of like tea and crumpets, it's more like seduction and a bloody end.
Oh my gosh, so that's where the vampires come in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is where the whole vampire thing gets interesting because you know how in most vampire films they're romanticized. They're all brooding and,
Yeah,
mysterious.
Dracula type.
Yeah, but Vampyres throws that out the window.
Oh, wow.
These vampires are all about like pure animalistic hunger, which the review said makes them way more unsettling.
I bet.
So yeah, ditching the Dracula vibes for something more primal,
Yeah.
I can already see how that sets a different tone.
For sure.
So how does the movie actually play out? Is it all blood and guts from the get-go or what?
Well, from what I gathered, it's more of a slow burn, like a really good thriller that just, builds the tension gradually and makes you anticipate what's going to happen.
Okay.
The review emphasized the dreamlike quality and unsettling atmosphere as like key elements.
So not your typical jump scare fest then?
No, not at all.
More about creating a mood and just letting the dread simmer.
Exactly. And the reviewer even compared it to like a fever dream at one point. So I'm really curious about the visuals.
Speaking of visuals, the review highlighted some pretty captivating cinematography.
Oh, yeah?
They mentioned soft focus shots, eerie lighting. Even the mansion itself becomes a character.
I love when they do that.
Yeah, all decayed beauty and secrets. I'm curious to see how they play with those elements to create that unsettling atmosphere.
And that contrast between beauty and decay is so interesting.
Yeah.
They even mentioned the stark difference between the mansion's cold exterior and the warm, inviting interior, which I thought could be a visual metaphor for the seductive but deadly nature of the vampires.
Yeah. So we've got this unsettling atmosphere. We've got the captivating visuals. But let's be honest, it is a horror movie.
Right.
So we have to address the gore.
Of course.
It can't all be just pretty pictures, right?
Right.
The review mentioned graphic violence, which knowing 1970s horror probably means practical effects that are intense.
Yeah, they didn't shy away from that aspect at all. But what the reviewer highlighted was that it wasn't just there for shock value.
Okay.
It really emphasized the rawness of the vampires, their primal nature.
Okay.
Such a stark contrast to the more polished, supernatural vampires we usually see in films.
Okay, so we've got atmosphere visuals and some pretty intense gore, but what about the characters?
Yeah.
Are they just stylish bloodsuckers, or do we actually get a sense of who they are?
Well, the reviews seem to focus on Fran and Miriam specifically, and especially their chemistry on screen.
Oh, cool.
They highlighted Fran's dominance. She's seductive and in total control,
Okay.
while Miriam seemed quieter and perhaps even conflicted about their lifestyle.
Interesting. So maybe a hint of depth there, which is always a plus in a horror movie.
Definitely.
And what about the men that they are preying on? Are they just like nameless victims, or do we get any insight into their side of the story?
Well, the reviewer specifically mentioned a character named Ted, who seems to be like their main target,
Oh.
the one who gets caught in their web. And then they also mentioned a traveling couple that stumbles upon the mansion and starts suspecting that something sinister is happening.
Oh, so they're kind of like the
outsiders?
Yeah, outsiders.
Yeah. Intruding on their little vampire world.
Okay, so there's Ted caught in their web. This traveling couple who might throw a wrench in their plans. Sounds like some interesting character dynamics there. And the reviewer mentioned a really specific detail about the sound design. Apparently the director uses these long stretches of near silence to heighten the tension.
Ooh, I love that.
Yeah, silence can be so much creepier than a loud jump scare.
Way creepier.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Speaking of sounds, they mentioned the music too, right?
Yeah, they described it as this mix of melancholy melodies and unsettling drones,
Okay.
which seems fitting given the film's overall atmosphere.
Right. It all seems to play into that hypnotic, nightmarish feeling the director was going for.
Exactly.
Hypnotic. That's an interesting word choice. It actually connects to another point the review brought up.
What?
The film's repetitive structure.
Oh.
They said some scenes repeat almost like a cycle of seduction and death playing out over and over again.
Right. And the reviewer posed it as a question, is it hypnotic, pulling you further into the film's world? Or does it become redundant, and a bit tiresome.
Hmm.
It seems like it could go either way, depending on your taste.
Good point. Now, while this sound design adds to the creepy vibe, the review does point out a couple things that some viewers might not like a lack of plot development and character depth.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's important to remember that this film isn't trying to be like a traditional narrative-driven horror movie.
Right.
You know, it's more about creating a mood and experience.
So it's less about following a complex plot and more about soaking in the atmosphere, the visuals, the unsettling feeling.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
That makes sense, but that does raise an interesting question for knowing your preferences for fast-paced plots versus really atmospheric horror. Which side do you think you'd lean towards in this case?
That's a great question, I think. With Vampyres, I think I might be okay with the, less plot-heavy approach.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like you said, it's just about letting yourself be drawn into the world and the mood. And honestly, the fact that it's a 70s film and those practical effects, that alone has me intrigued.
Oh, yeah.
CGI just doesn't have that same raw feel.
Totally agree. There's something about the tangible, almost gritty nature of those practical effects that really gets under your skin.
Yeah.
You can tell there's artistry involved, even if it is a bit gruesome.
Right.
It's not just about shock value. It's about creating something visceral and real.
Definitely. Okay, so we've touched on this idea of flipping the script on typical horror tropes.
Right.
The female vampires being the predators, using their sexuality as a weapon.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how that plays out in the film, especially for a movie from that era.
It is a fascinating subversion of expectations.
Right.
Especially when you consider that in most horror films, it's the woman who's typically the victim, the damsel in distress.
Right.
But in Vampyres, the women are the ones in control, and they're not afraid to use their power to get what they want.
It makes you wonder, too, if there's any commentary there about the societal roles of women during that time period. Like maybe it was a way for the director to challenge those norms, even if it was subtle.
That's a great point. It's always interesting to analyze films within their historical context, that it's possible the director was making a statement, even if it wasn't overt.
Yeah, and the reviewer mentioned that the film explores themes of fate.
Oh.
The vampires being stuck in this endless loop of seduction and death.
Right.
That kind of adds a layer of tragedy to their characters, doesn't it?
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of bleakness there. They're driven by this insatiable hunger, and it seems like they can never truly escape it.
Right.
It makes you wonder if they even want to break free or if they're just resigned to their fate.
That's a great question. Do they find any satisfaction in what they do, or is it just this primal urge they can't control? I guess that ties into the whole blurring of pleasure and death thing, too.
Yeah, exactly. It's like those two things are so intertwined for them that it's hard to imagine one without the other.
Right.
And that's what makes it so disturbing, but also so fascinating.
Like, are they getting any real pleasure from it, or is it just part of the cycle they're trapped in?
It's a pretty dark commentary on the nature of desire. Definitely. And it's something that might leave you thinking about it long after the movie is over.
Okay, so we've talked about the unconventional vampires, the slow burn atmosphere, the disturbing visuals, and now this layer of existential dread. I mean, it's sounding less like a typical horror flick and more like a film that really wants to get under your skin and make you think.
It sounds like it's aiming for a more psychological, thought-provoking kind of horror.
And while that might not appeal to everyone, it's definitely something that I think you appreciate in a film. You like those movies that stay with you after the credits roll, right? The ones that make you think about things in a new way.
Absolutely. And that's where Vampyres seems to succeed. It takes a familiar genre of vampires and turns it on its head, forces you to reconsider everything you thought you knew.
I'm curious, though, about the whole slow burn aspect. Would you say it's more like a suspenseful thriller in that sense, or is there still that distinct horror element throughout?
Based on the review, it sounds like there's a balance.
Okay.
While it slowly ratchets up the tension, there are still moments of pure horror, especially with those practical gore effects we talked about.
Right.
It's less about jump scares and more about creating a constant sense of unease.
Okay. That makes sense. Like a slow, creeping dread that builds throughout the film.
Exactly. It's like a dark cloud slowly enveloping you instead of a sudden clap of thunder.
And knowing your preferences, you tend to lean more towards psychological thrillers and character-driven narratives.
Right.
So even though the reviewer pointed out a lack of character development, do you think the unique premise and the unsettling atmosphere might outweigh that potential drawback for you?
It's hard to say for sure without seeing the film, but based on what we've discussed, I think there's enough to pique my interest. The idea of these predatory female vampires, the themes of fate and desire, the unconventional approach to the genre, it all seems to point to a film that's trying to do something different, something unique.
That's what I'm thinking too, is like, even if the characters aren't super fleshed out, the very premise itself has a certain psychological depth to it.
Right. And I think the reviewer was more commenting on the fact that it's not a dialogue-heavy film with a lot of exposition.
Yeah.
It seems like a lot of the character development, or at least the exploration of their motivations, happens visually and through the atmosphere.
That makes sense, and sometimes that can be even more effective, right?
Oh, for sure.
Like when a film trusts the audience to piece things together and draw their own conclusions.
Absolutely. And based on what you know about your taste in films, I think you'd appreciate that kind of subtlety.
Yeah.
You like films that make you work a little bit, that don't spoon-feed you everything.
Definitely, it's more rewarding that way. Like you feel like you're discovering things along with the characters.
And that sense of discovery is something that Vampyres seems to offer in spades.
Yeah.
It's not just a retread of familiar vampire tropes. It's a film that's constantly pushing boundaries and challenging expectations.
Okay, so we've talked about the lack of plot, the unconventional characters, the unsettling atmosphere, and the potential for psychological depth. But there's one element we haven't touched on yet, the director's vision.
Right. The review mentioned that José Ramón Larraz was really intentional about creating this film, driven by instinct, sensation, and a blurring of pleasure and death. What do you make of that?
I think it speaks to the film's overall ambition. It's not just trying to be a scary movie. It's trying to be a sensory exploration of some pretty dark and complex themes.
Yep.
And that's what makes it so intriguing.
It's like he's using the vampire genre as a vehicle to explore those deeper ideas.
Exactly. And that's something that I think you, as someone who appreciates thought-provoking cinema, would find really appealing.
Yeah, I'm already getting that sense. Like, it's not just about the blood and fangs. It's about something more primal, more unsettling.
Right, and I think that's what makes Vampyres so unique. It takes a familiar monster and strips it down to its barest essence, revealing something both terrifying and strangely beautiful.
So based on everything we've discussed so far, it sounds like Vampyres is a film that demands a certain kind of viewer, someone who's willing to embrace the slow burn, the unconventional narrative, the unsettling atmosphere. Definitely, it's not for everyone, that's for sure. But for those who are looking for a horror film that challenges expectations and delves into the darker corners of human nature, it could be a truly rewarding experience.
And knowing your taste, I'd say you fall into that category of viewer.
I think you're right. I'm definitely intrigued. It sounds like a film that could really get under my skin and stay with me long after the credits roll.
That's what I'm thinking too. It's like a film that doesn't just want to scare you, it wants to make you feel something, even if that something is a little bit uncomfortable.
Exactly. It's a film that wants to provoke a reaction, to make you question your assumptions about the genre, about yourself.
Okay, so we've talked about the good, the unconventional, the unsettling, but let's be honest, no film is perfect.
Right.
The review did mention some potential criticisms.
Right. Aside from the lack of plot,
The
biggest criticisms seem to be the repetitive structure.
hypnotic cycle of seduction and death, right? Like, at what point does it become too much?
Exactly. And it seems like that's a question that even the reviewer was grappling with. They didn't seem to be sure if it would work for everyone. It could be seen as either captivating or tedious, depending on the viewer.
Well, that's certainly something to keep in mind.
And it's something that might even change depending on your mood going into the film.
Oh, yeah.
Like if you're looking for something fast-paced and action-packed, the repetitive nature might be frustrating.
Right.
But if you're in the mood for something more atmospheric and hypnotic, it might actually enhance the experience.
Right, like it could either lull you into that dreamy state the reviewer mentioned, or it could just feel like the film is spinning its wheels.
It's a gamble, for sure. But sometimes those gambles pay off in unexpected ways. Think about those films you've seen that have a similar hypnotic quality, those ones that draw you into their world and don't let go. Would you say those are films you tend to enjoy?
I would actually, there's a certain allure to that kind of filmmaking. It's like the film is casting a spell on you.
And that's the thing about Vampyres. It sounds like it's trying to cast that spell. It's trying to pull you into its world of darkness, desire, and death.
And whether or not you surrender to that spell, well, that's up to you.
It's a choice you'll have to make, but at least now you have all the information you need to make an informed decision.
Right. You know, the premise, the style, the strengths, the weaknesses, the director's vision, it's all on the table.
So what do you think? Is it a gamble you're willing to take?
Honestly, I think I am. There's something about the whole package, the unconventional vampires, the unsettling atmosphere, the thought-provoking themes that just really appeals to me.
I think you're making the right call. And, even if it's not your cup of tea, at least you'll have experienced something different, something outside the norm.
Exactly. And isn't that what exploring film is all about? Discovering new things, challenging your expectations, finding those hidden gems that speak to you on a deeper level?
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, so I'm putting Vampyres on my watch list, but before I do, there's one more thing I'm curious about. We've talked about how the film flips traditional gender roles in horror, but the review didn't go into detail about how that theme plays out specifically.
That's a good point, and it's something that might be worth exploring further.
Yeah, like, how does the film portray the power dynamics between the vampires and their victims? Is there a sense of agency on the part of the women they prey on, or is it all about manipulation and control?
Those are definitely questions worth considering, and it's something you can pay attention to as you watch the film.
I'm really intrigued by this idea of how Vampyres subverts those typical horror tropes, especially given the time period it was made in.
It's a fascinating aspect of the film and one that could lead to some really interesting insights.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the unconventional vampires, the slow burn atmosphere, the psychological depth, the director's vision, the potential criticisms. I think we've given you a pretty thorough understanding of what Vampyres is all about.
And hopefully we've sparked your curiosity enough to make you want to see it for yourself.
But before we wrap up, I'd love to hear your final thoughts on the film. What's the one thing that really stood out to you, the thing that made you think, okay, I need to see this?
For me, it's the way the film seems to embrace ambiguity. It doesn't give you easy answers. It doesn't tie everything up in a neat little bow. It leaves you with questions, with a sense of unease, with a desire to delve deeper into the darkness.
That's a great point, and I think that's what makes Vampyres such a compelling film. It's not just a horror movie, it's an experience, a journey into the unknown.
And sometimes those journeys are the most rewarding, even if they lead us to some pretty dark places.
All on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this part of our deep dive.
But we're not done yet. There's still more to discuss, more to uncover.
Exactly. Stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive into Vampyres, where we'll delve even deeper into the film's themes, its impact, and its enduring legacy. Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into Vampyres. And, it's interesting how this film, even though it's from the 70s, seems to touch on ideas that are still so relevant today. We were just talking about how it flips the script on typical gender roles and horror.
Yeah.
Usually it's the woman who's the victim, but here it's the female vampires who are calling the shots.
It is a pretty bold move for any horror film, let alone one that was made during that era. It makes you wonder, was the director making a conscious statement about, female empowerment? Or was it more about just subverting expectations for shock value?
Yeah, it's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's definitely something we can, really think about while watching the film. The review mentioned Fran being the dominant one, while Miriam seemed, a bit more hesitant. I'd be curious to see how that power dynamic plays out between them two, not just with their victims.
Absolutely. It's like you have these layers of power dynamics happening between the vampires themselves and then between the vampires and the men they're preying on, which I think is a recipe for some seriously unsettling and thought-provoking stuff.
Totally. And speaking of unsettling, we've talked about the film's slow burn atmosphere, the hypnotic visuals, and that graphic violence. But one thing that really stuck with me was that feeling of unease the review kept mentioning.
Right.
Like, it's not just about being scared, it's about feeling disturbed, maybe even a little complicit in what's happening on screen.
Yeah, the reviewer even mentioned feeling like they were being pulled into the vampires' world, almost like a hypnotic trance.
Wow.
And with those repetitive scenes, they mentioned the cycle of seduction and death. You can kind of see how that could work.
Yeah.
It's like you're caught in that loop along with the characters.
It's like the film is a vampire itself, slowly draining you of your resistance and drawing you into its world of darkness and desire. I mean, that's pretty powerful stuff.
It really does sound like it. And that blurring of pleasure and death the director was going for, I imagine that plays a big part in creating that unsettling feeling.
Totally. And for you, someone who loves those psychological thrillers and, those films that explore the dark side of human nature, I feel like Vampyres is ticking all the boxes.
It seems like it.
Even with the potential criticism about the plot being a bit thin.
Yeah, I think the atmosphere, the visuals, and the psychological aspects more than make up for that. It's like, who needs a complicated plot when you have pure visceral dread just seeping out of every frame?
Exactly. And with the director's intention to create this world that's, driven by instinct and sensation, it sounds like it's less about following a linear story and more about experiencing something primal, something that taps into those base desires we all have, even if we don't want to admit it.
It's like the film is holding up a mirror to our own darkness.
Yeah.
Forcing us to confront those parts of ourselves that we usually keep hidden.
And isn't that what great horror is all about, making us confront those uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world around us?
Absolutely. It's about pushing boundaries,
Yeah.
challenging our perceptions, and making us question everything we thought we knew.
So to kind of wrap things up here, if you had to describe Vampyres in just a few words, what would you say?
Haunting, erotic, and thought-provoking.
Right.
So a film that gets under your skin and stays there, making you question everything you thought you knew about vampires and maybe even yourself.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So for those of you listening, think about what we've discussed today. We've explored the unique premise, the unsettling atmosphere, the graphic violence, the thought-provoking themes, even the potential drawbacks. Now it's up to you to decide, is Vampyres a film you're willing to take a bite out of?
And remember, even if it's not for you, at least you've expanded your horizons and explored, a corner of horror cinema that you might not have otherwise.
That's what these deep dives are all about, taking a chance, exploring something new, and maybe finding that hidden gem that really resonates with you.
Exactly.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Vampyres. We'll see you next time.